There are moments in long-running family sagas when something subtle shifts. Not a police report, not a court document, not a viral accusation, just a familiar face walking back into frame. When Kenny Whittaker appeared again, casually, unscripted, drinking a beer and talking the way he always has, people didn't just notice that he was there. They noticed what wasn't there. No visible hostility, no visible fear, no obvious fracture between him and the people he was standing beside. And in a situation that has been dominated by allegations, removals, arrests, and online warfare, that absence felt louder than any statement. For months, the public narrative around the extended Whittaker circle has been defined by conflict. Claims of manipulation, claims of drug use, claims of exploitation, claims of money missing, claims of people being controlled. So when Kenny shows up, still visiting, still talking freely, still interacting, it forces a question that cuts through the noise. If the environment was as violently hostile as some claim, why is he still there? That doesn't prove innocence. It doesn't erase investigations. It doesn't cancel out court proceedings. But it complicates the storyline. Because human behavior is hard to fake over time. If someone is truly terrified, you often see avoidance. If someone is truly abused, you often see distance. If someone is truly at war with another person, you rarely see them casually stopping by. Instead, what viewers saw was something more ordinary. Conversation, disagreement, opinion, but not visible fear. Kenny didn't appear coached. He didn't appear hesitant. He didn't appear like someone walking on eggshells. He spoke bluntly. About BJ. About tension. About what he thinks is happening. And blunt speech is something the Whittaker family has never struggled with. But this is where things get delicate. Because visible comfort does not automatically equal safety. People can remain around dysfunction for decades. People can normalize chaos. People can tolerate unhealthy dynamics because they've known nothing else. So the real significance of Kenny's return isn't that it proves anything. It's that it adds texture. When a narrative becomes too clean, hero versus villain, victim versus monster, reality has a way of interrupting it with inconvenient details. Kenny's presence is one of those details. He still comes around. He still talks. He still interacts with the same people some viewers insist are dangerous. And when asked directly whether there's hostility, he says no. That matters, not because it settles the debate, but because it challenges absolutes. Online, the situation has often been framed as a hostage dynamic. Betty trapped, Larry compromised, BJ controlling everything, drug influence, fear inside the house. Those are serious allegations. Yet Kenny describes something more complicated. Frustration, disagreement, suspicion, but not open warfare. When he suggests Betty may fear BJ, that's heavy. When he suggests methamphetamine changes behavior, that's serious. But when is asked whether he sees violence, whether there is visible abuse, he doesn't describe scenes of terror. He describes dysfunction. And dysfunction is not the same as criminal abuse. It can be destructive. It can be unhealthy. It can create long-term damage. But legally and factually, it's different. The internet often compresses everything into extremes. Either everything is fine, or everything is evil. The truth, especially in families shaped by poverty, generational trauma, and limited education, is usually somewhere in the middle. Messy, contradictory, uncomfortable. Kenny's appearance brought back something many viewers had forgotten. This is still a family. A fractured one. A loud one. A flawed one. But a family. And families do something strange. They fight. They accuse. They reconcile. They circle back. They rarely operate in straight lines. When Kenny says, "If I was such a bad person, why am I still here?" that's not a legal defense. It's a social observation. Presence is data. It doesn't override investigations, but it complicates them. And complication is where documentaries live. Because the hardest truth in all of this is simple. You can't fully understand what's happening inside a house from a camera outside of it. Kenny's return doesn't settle the debate, but it forces a recalibration. If the situation was pure terror, why the casual interaction? If it was pure manipulation, why the open disagreement? If it was pure abuse, why the continued presence of extended family members who aren't under direct control? These questions don't exonerate anyone, but they prevent oversimplification. And oversimplification has already done enough damage in this story. Over the next sections, we're going to break down what Kenny's words actually reveal, not emotionally, not hypothetically, but structurally. What his answers suggest about control, fear, drug allegations, family loyalty, and the difference between dysfunction and criminal harm. Because sometimes what people notice isn't what someone said, it's what didn't happen. And this time, what didn't happen was visible fear. Comment below with one word, complicated or clear. Do you think Kenny's return makes the situation more complicated, or does it confirm what you already believed? When Kenny spoke, people weren't just listening to what he said. They were measuring what it meant. Because in a situation already shaped by arrests, fraud investigations, adult protective services involvement, and public accusations, every word now carries weight. And what Kenny revealed wasn't explosive. It was revealing. There's a difference. He didn't describe physical beatings. He didn't describe visible injuries. He didn't describe people hiding or whispering in fear. Instead, he described tension around BJ. He described frustration. He described the possibility of drug use. And he described something more subtle, influence. That distinction matters, because influence can feel like control without being legally provable control. And in families where addiction is rumored, that gray area expands. When Kenny says, anybody on methamphetamine will do all kinds of things, he isn't presenting evidence. He's expressing concern, but concern is not conviction. Online audiences often blur that line. Speculation becomes certainty. Concern becomes proof. Opinion becomes fact. That's how narratives spiral. The more interesting layer is this. Kenny didn't claim Larry was definitely using drugs. When asked directly, he said he didn't know. That pause matters. In high-conflict environments, people usually jump at certainty. Instead, he left space. And that space is where the real story lives. Because the public conversation has largely revolved around two possible explanations. Either the household was deeply unsafe and intervention was necessary, or the situation was exaggerated and escalated by outside influence. Kenny's presence doesn't land cleanly in either camp. He acknowledges dysfunction. He acknowledges possible substance abuse. He acknowledges fear. But he also acknowledges continuity. He's still there. They are still there. The social structure hasn't collapsed. That raises an uncomfortable question. If Betty was truly being terrorized daily, would Kenny still be casually visiting? It's possible. Families sometimes normalize dangerous dynamics. But it's equally possible that what exists is something less cinematic and more mundane. Long-term poverty, addiction cycles, codependency, loyalty tangled with resentment. Those don't make for viral headlines, but they are far more common than organized schemes of hostage-like control. Another point that stands out is the repeated emphasis on routine. Laundry every day, doctor visits monthly, cooking breakfast, hanging clothes on the line. Routine is stability's shadow. If severe abuse is happening continuously, routines often fracture. That doesn't mean everything was safe. It means nothing was obviously chaotic. This becomes especially relevant when discussing the removal of family members by authorities. Adult Protective Services does not remove people casually. But they also don't remove people based on YouTube comment sections. There are thresholds. Documentation. Reports. Observations. Kenny's narrative indirectly challenges the idea that the household was in constant crisis. He describes normal interactions. Timmy laughing. People sitting together. No flinching. No visible terror. Again, visible does not equal invisible. Abuse can be hidden. Neglect can be subtle. Manipulation can be quiet. But the absence of obvious distress complicates a one-dimensional story. Then there's the issue of coaching. Allegations surfaced that Timmy was coached to describe BJ as abusive. Kenny leans into that idea. He implies scripting. He implies influence. He implies narrative shaping. If that's true, it reframes earlier claims dramatically. Because if statements were influenced, the foundation of certain interventions shifts. But that's a massive if. And documentaries don't operate on if. They operate on patterns. One pattern we see repeatedly in this saga is escalation through exposure. Filming begins. Content grows. Money appears. Conflicts amplify. Authorities intervene. Arrests follow. The digital lens changes outcomes. Kenny's return subtly highlights that dynamic. He mentions that when Mark was around, removals didn't happen. That doesn't absolve anyone, but it introduces timing as a variable. Timing matters. If interventions accelerate only after specific content styles emerge, that deserves scrutiny, not accusation. Scrutiny. There's also something deeply human in Kenny's blunt loyalty. When he says, "You're not taking Betty from that house," he's not arguing policy. He's describing identity. Betty isn't just an elderly woman in a fragile house. She is the anchor, the caretaker, the emotional center, the constant. Removing someone like that isn't just logistical. It's psychological demolition. That may explain resistance. Not criminal resistance. Emotional resistance. Now let's address something carefully. Just because no one died under Betty's care does not automatically mean conditions were safe. Survival is a low bar, but long-term medical visits do suggest at least minimal external oversight. Mandated reporters, doctors included, are required to flag signs of abuse or neglect. If consistent visits occurred without documented escalation for years, that's relevant context. Again, not proof of perfection. Context. The internet often collapses complexity into moral battles. This situation is not simple. There can be financial exploitation and emotional loyalty simultaneously. There can be poor living conditions and genuine affection simultaneously. There can be drug use allegations and long-term attachment simultaneously. Kenny embodies that contradiction. He criticizes BJ. He questions dynamics. But he remains present. Presence signals something. Either he doesn't perceive immediate danger, or he has accepted the environment as it is. Both interpretations are possible. And that's what makes this so difficult to categorize. When asked if Betty should have been removed, Kenny suggests she wouldn't leave anyway. That statement reveals autonomy. Betty may be vulnerable, but vulnerability does not erase agency. That distinction is critical. Public narratives sometimes strip vulnerable adults of decision-making power entirely. But autonomy exists on a spectrum. Betty cooking, Betty doing laundry, Betty making choices. These details matter, because intervention decisions hinge on capacity, not sympathy, capacity. Now we move to something subtle but powerful: energy. Viewers pointed out that when Timmy sat next to BJ, he didn't flinch. He laughed. He colored. He remained relaxed. Trauma often reveals itself through hypervigilance. Again, not always, but often. The absence of flinching isn't conclusive, but it's observable. And documentaries deal in observation before interpretation. So what does Kenny's return actually change? It shifts the frame from pure villain narrative to layered family dysfunction. It reintroduces gray areas. It forces reconsideration of absolutes. It reminds viewers that this isn't a scripted series. It's real people in a real rural environment shaped by decades of poverty and isolation. And the hardest truth may be this: multiple things can be true at the same time. There can be criminal financial exploitation happening externally. There can be addiction internally. There can be loyalty and resentment intertwined. There can be genuine care mixed with harmful dynamics. The world prefers a single villain. Reality rarely provides one. In Part 3, we're going to examine the psychological dimension of what viewers think they see: body language, routine, fear signals, and the difference between internet perception and lived reality. Because sometimes the loudest narrative isn't the most accurate one. Comment below: loyalty or manipulation? Which do you think plays the bigger role in what we're seeing? There's a reason body language became one of the most debated topics in this story. Because when words are limited, people start studying movement. They watch for flinches. They watch for eye contact. They watch for distance between chairs. They watch for who reaches for what. And in the case of the Whittakers, viewers became amateur behavioral analysts overnight. Timmy didn't flinch. Betty reached for her drink calmly. People sat close together. No one appeared visibly terrified. For some, that meant there was no abuse. For others, it meant the family had normalized dysfunction. But here's the truth that often gets lost. Body language is context-dependent. A lack of flinching does not automatically equal safety, and a flinch does not automatically equal abuse. Human behavior adapts to environment. If someone grows up in chaos, chaos feels normal. If someone grows up in poverty, instability feels routine. If someone grows up around substance use, unpredictability becomes background noise. So when viewers say, "He didn't look scared," what they are really saying is, "He didn't look scared to me." And that to me matters. Most people interpreting these clips have never lived in deep rural poverty. They've never navigated generational isolation. They've never spent decades in the same few square miles with limited outside intervention. So perception becomes filtered through unfamiliar standards. Now let's talk about routine again, because routine keeps resurfacing. Laundry every day, breakfast every morning, doctor visits every month. Routine is one of the strongest indicators of environmental stability, not luxury. Stability. It suggests structure. Structure doesn't guarantee safety, but total instability almost always guarantees harm. When Timmy colored calmly beside BJ, viewers split into camps. One side said, "See? No abuse." The other said, "Victims can sit next to abusers." Both statements are technically true. That's what makes this so difficult. Because what people are really arguing about isn't the clip. They are arguing about narrative control. Once an allegation enters the public space, confirmation bias takes over. If you already believe someone is dangerous, every neutral moment looks staged. If you already believe someone is innocent, Every red flag looks exaggerated. Kenny's presence disrupts both extremes. He doesn't portray a perfect household. He doesn't portray a horror scene. He portrays tension led into familiarity. That's far more common than either extreme. Now let's address the coaching allegations more directly. Coaching changes everything. If vulnerable individuals are guided into repeating specific statements, then the credibility of those statements becomes complicated. But coaching is also difficult to prove definitively without documentation. What viewers saw were moments where prompts appeared, someone interpreting what Timmy said, someone repeating questions, someone leading language. That doesn't automatically invalidate everything said, but it introduces doubt. And in legal environments, doubt reshapes outcomes. Remember, adult protective investigations don't rely solely on YouTube clips. They rely on interviews, observations, documentation, and professional assessments. If coaching influenced public perception, it may not have influenced official findings. That distinction matters. Another layer people overlook is emotional loyalty. Families can argue, scream, accuse, retract, and still choose each other, especially in isolated communities, especially in environments where outside systems have historically failed. When Kenny says Betty wouldn't leave that house, it speaks to attachment. Attachment to place. Attachment to routine. Attachment to identity. People often underestimate how powerful place is. A porch is not just wood. It's memory. It's predictability. It's control over who enters your view. When people online say, Timmy would love to be back on the porch, they are not romanticizing poverty. They are acknowledging familiarity. And familiarity can feel safer than structured care. That's uncomfortable, because structured care is supposed to be the safer option. But for someone who has spent decades in one environment, even flawed familiarity can outweigh sterile stability. This doesn't mean intervention was wrong. It means intervention is psychologically disruptive. Now consider something deeper. When exposure increases, stress increases. When stress increases, behavior changes. Since the family became widely known, the household dynamic hasn't existed in isolation. It has existed under surveillance. Cameras, comments, phone calls, investigations, fundraisers, allegations. That pressure reshapes behavior. Some people become defensive. Some become reactive. Some become withdrawn. Some become louder. So what viewers are analyzing now is not pre-viral life. It's post-exposure life. That difference is massive. If someone appears agitated now, is it because of internal household dynamics? Or because they are living inside a national microscope? You can't separate those easily. Another factor is resource flow. When money entered the equation, power shifted. Anytime sudden funds appear in a low-resource environment, relationships strain. Who controls it? Who decides spending? Who answers questions? Who handles outsiders? Financial tension fractures families far more quietly than physical conflict. And in this case, the financial storyline exploded publicly. Arrests, allegations, fraud investigations, disputes over who got paid. That kind of external conflict bleeds into internal relationships. It's naive to think it wouldn't. So when Kenny hints at dysfunction, it may not reflect decades of hidden abuse. It may reflect months of escalating pressure. There's another psychological phenomenon at play here: parasocial attachment. Viewers feel protective. They feel involved. They feel invested. And when outcomes don't align with expectations, frustration turns into blame. Someone must be responsible. But sometimes systems collide rather than villains acting alone. Let's return to the meth allegation Kenny referenced. Substance abuse drastically alters household dynamics. It can create unpredictability. It can create manipulation. It can create fear. But it can also coexist with affection. That's the part outsiders struggle with. Addiction doesn't automatically erase love, and love doesn't automatically eliminate harm. Those truths can sit side by side. Now here's the hardest part. When authorities remove individuals, they don't base decisions on whether someone laughs on camera. They base decisions on capacity, risk factors, and documented conditions. The public rarely sees those full reports, so we're left with fragments, clips, statements, live streams, comments. Fragments create stories, but they rarely create full clarity. Kenny's return didn't solve anything. It complicated everything. It reintroduced humanity into a narrative that had hardened into sides. It reminded viewers that people still interact normally, still laugh, still visit, still argue, still sit together. That doesn't erase allegations, but it softens the caricature, and caricatures are dangerous, because once people become caricatures, villain, victim, hero, nuance disappears. And without nuance, understanding collapses. So what are we actually watching unfold? Not a clue-cut horror story. Not a clean redemption arc. We're watching a rural family under digital pressure, navigating poverty, addiction rumors, financial disputes, legal scrutiny, and fractured trust, all while strangers dissect their body language frame by frame. That's not simple. And it's certainly not something that can be reduced to one viral clip. What happens to a family when outside intervention collides with internal loyalty? And who pays the emotional cost long after the cameras move on? Comment below one word: perception or reality? Which do you think is shaping this story more right now? Intervention changes everything. Not just legally, not just structurally. Emotionally, when authorities step into a family dynamic, they don't just remove people. They remove familiarity. They remove routine. They remove identity anchors. And whether that intervention is justified or controversial, the psychological aftermath doesn't care about opinion. It still lands. In the Whittaker situation, the removals created an immediate fracture. 3 individuals gone, 2 left behind, extended relatives orbiting the edges, online audiences demanding explanations, creators defending themselves, accusations flying, arrests following. But beneath all of that noise is a simpler, quieter question. What does it feel like inside that house now? When a home loses members, the air changes. Chairs sit empty. Conversations echo. Habits break. Even if someone believes removal was necessary, that doesn't erase grief. And grief doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like denial. Sometimes it looks like doubling down on loyalty. Kenny's presence in the conversation reminded viewers of something uncomfortable. Intervention doesn't automatically sever bonds. People still visit. They still laugh. They still defend. They still argue. Because relationships formed over decades don't dissolve in one administrative decision. That's where internal loyalty becomes complicated. If Betty feels torn between siblings and safety, between familiarity and oversight, between love and external judgment, that tension doesn't resolve neatly. And outsiders often underestimate how powerful family loyalty is in isolated communities. In environments where systems have historically failed, family becomes the system. Even when flawed, even when chaotic, even when risky. So when viewers ask, why didn't she just leave? Or why didn't she push them out? Or why didn't someone speak up sooner? They are applying urban logic to rural reality. Isolation reshapes decision-making. When you live in a small, tight-knit environment, confrontation carries heavier consequences, loyalty carries heavier weight, and reputation circulates faster than resolution. Now layer in something else. Public humiliation. The Whittakers didn't gradually become known. They became viral. Their living conditions were analyzed, their habits critiqued, their genetics discussed, their behaviors replayed, their family tree diagrammed, their finances debated. That kind of exposure creates a pressure cooker, even if someone had once felt secure in their dynamic. Constant scrutiny destabilizes everything. It creates paranoia. It creates defensiveness. It creates power struggles. And when money enters that mix, it amplifies instability. Money isn't neutral. It shifts hierarchy. If donations were discussed publicly, if revenue was debated, if accusations of financial misuse surfaced, then trust fractures internally. Even if no crime is proven, the suspicion alone is corrosive. And in a family that already operates under limited structure, corrosion spreads fast. Now let's confront another uncomfortable truth. External rescuers sometimes become new power centers. When someone steps in with resources, with cameras, with influence, with audience reach, they gain leverage, even unintentionally. Access becomes currency. Narrative becomes currency. Visibility becomes currency. So when Kenny says there wasn't hostility before, that people still interacted normally, it raises a deeper question. Did exposure destabilize more than it protected? That's not an accusation. It's a structural observation. Anytime a private family becomes public property, internal dynamics shift. People feel watched. People feel judged. People feel misrepresented. And that pressure can push fractures to the surface faster than they would have emerged organically. Then comes the legal escalation. An arrest changes the tone entirely. When someone is charged with financial exploitation or fraud, the narrative shifts from messy to criminal. But criminal charges do not automatically clarify household dynamics. They address financial conduct. They address alleged schemes. They address alleged misuse. They do not determine whether family relationships were emotionally safe or unsafe. Those are separate layers. And that distinction matters, because viewers often collapse them together. If money was mishandled, they assume everything else was malicious. If someone was arrested, they assume every action was predatory. But human systems are rarely that linear. Now let's talk about emotional aftermath. When removal happens, remaining family members experience a mix of relief and shock. Relief that pressure might decrease. Shock that routine is shattered. And when outside voices debate whether the removal was justified, that internal confusion intensifies. Imagine sitting in that house now. Imagine hearing strangers debate whether your environment was abusive, whether your loyalty was misguided, whether your judgment was flawed. That doesn't build clarity. It builds defensiveness. And defensiveness can harden into silence. Silence can be protective, but it can also prevent repair. Another factor people ignore is identity collapse. For years, Betty's identity appeared centered around caregiving, cooking, laundry, routine, doctor visits, structure. If caregiving roles shift, identity shifts. And when identity shifts abruptly, people cling tighter to what remains. Sometimes that means defending the past, even if the past was imperfect, because admitting fault feels like admitting failure. And that's psychologically brutal. Now consider Kenny's statement about not taking Betty from that house. That speaks to autonomy. Autonomy is legally complex in cases involving vulnerable adults. Capacity matters. Ability to perform basic functions matters. Ability to articulate decisions matters. But autonomy also carries emotional weight. For someone who has lived independently for decades, forced relocation can feel like punishment, even if it's protective. That tension is impossible to simplify. Then there's the community layer. Small towns observe quietly. They talk privately. They assess slowly. When outsiders enter loudly, locals often close ranks. Kenny's calm demeanor suggests something subtle. The story being told online may not fully reflect how the situation feels locally. That doesn't invalidate concerns, but it complicates them. Local perception and online perception rarely align perfectly. Online, urgency dominates. Locally, familiarity does. Now add this final piece. Once intervention happens, trust rarely returns to its previous state. Even if allegations are disproven, even if charges are resolved, even if misunderstandings are clarified, the rupture remains, because surveillance leaves residue, and the Whittakers are now permanently part of public memory. They cannot return to anonymity. They cannot rewind exposure. They cannot erase speculation. That reality becomes the hardest moment of all. Not the arrest, not the allegation, not the coaching debate. The permanence. They will always be the family that went viral. The family debated on live streams. The family dissected in comment sections. The family investigated. The family argued over. That kind of permanent visibility changes how you move, how you speak, how you trust. So when Kenny returned and spoke casually, laughed, answered directly, people noticed something different. Maybe not a dramatic reveal, not a shocking confession, not a hidden secret exposed, but a return to human scale, less spectacle, more familiarity. And that subtle shift may matter more than any accusation, because it reminds us that behind every viral narrative, there are still people navigating consequences in real time. Comment one word below, loyalty or intervention. Which do you think carries more weight in this story right now? The hardest moment isn't always the arrest. It isn't the argument. It isn't the live stream. It isn't the allegation. It's the aftermath. When the cameras move on. When the comments slow down. When the legal process grinds forward quietly. When the house feels different at night. That's where the real story sits. Kenny's return didn't expose a secret. It exposed something simpler. The relationships didn't evaporate. People still show up. They still talk. They still care, even if imperfectly. And that complicates everything. Because protection and loyalty often collide. Intervention and autonomy clash. Public concern and private dignity rarely align cleanly. What happens next won't be decided in a comment section. It won't be decided by speculation. It won't be decided by one live stream. It will be decided by structure, by oversight, by whether vulnerability is protected without becoming spectacle again. The Whittakers are facing their hardest moment not because of what was said online, but because their private world can never be fully private again. And that changes everything. One word in the comments. Protect or preserve. Which matters more now?